thanks so much everyone for joining today's session. My name is Abby. I'm a consultant at Turner & Townsend. We're joined today by Claire Brown, who is a senior consultant at Turner & Townsend, and we're looking today at climate literacy for social housing providers. So this is a Social Housing Retrofit Accelerator, or SHRA event, which is fully funded by the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero and delivered by Turner & Townsend. Claire, I will hand over to you to kick off today's session.
Thank you so much, Abby. Always a pleasure to come and do these masterclasses. So yeah, the first question we're asking then is really about what your biggest challenges around talking about climate literacy. And this can be about the topic of climate change. It can be with work colleagues, it can be at home, and whatever it is. So please do join in, because it's always really valuable to us to hear people's opinions and people's thoughts. In terms of the slides that we'll be going through today, what we're trying to think about here is putting into context the climate emergency, particularly for those of us who are in social housing and retrofit. It's about education in terms of particular applicants, so future funding streams that you are rolling out at the moment with Wave 2, and thinking about housing stock in the future, thinking about your wider portfolios. We'll think about how to start on a carbon reduction journey, and we'll be really looking into how to put the climate emergency into the context of any retrofit project for you, your organisation, and what I think is really important, the residents who will benefit from your project. We've got 3 sections in this masterclass. So we'll start about looking at the context of climate change, then we'll move on to kind of accounting for your greenhouse gases, and the last section will consider the action planning to move your project forward. So I think it's really important to get the data, to get the science. So if we start at the very beginning, the very process of enabling life on Earth is around global warming. We get energy from the sun, and it's essential to life on Earth. Greenhouse gases, which include carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide, exist within that atmosphere, and they trap some of that energy within the atmosphere to maintain and determine the temperature of the Earth. That temperature is historically there as something to enable us to have life, for organisms to exist, for bacteria to exist. So it is essential, and it is part of the makeup of our Earth that we occupy. So we have the energy coming in from the sun, we have those gases trapped within that to enable us to have life. Where we find the challenge is where we are right now. Through human activities, we release more of these greenhouse gases than we have done historically. Adding more enables more heat to be trapped in the atmosphere, which in turn leads to further temperatures, which we now use in the phrase climate change. As a result of these warmer temperatures, we also see changing weather. This includes the occurrence of storms. I'm sure all of you are well aware of the the storms we've been recently having in the UK, and that absolutely has links to what we are noticing with climate change. So in terms of what is the impact on climate, here you can see 5 independent climate research hubs and the temperatures that they have been recording since the early 1880s. You can see that for the most part, they have all recorded similar temperatures. Having data can be really vital to us in getting buy-in for any climate change decarbonisation plans with our key stakeholders. I always find that going back to the data, the graphs, the information from different sources, a really useful way of getting that buy-in. When we're talking about data, you might have come across the terminology around ppm. So this is parts per million. Even from the 1850s, scientists knew that some gas had the ability to retain heat and could make an impact. As of 2022, we're close to 420 parts per million. The pre-industrial level is 300 parts per million. Earth's climate has changed throughout history. We can see this in terms of millions of years. So this graph, again, really useful in showing that there are fluctuations historically. But in terms of where we are now, this goes significantly higher than we have ever seen before. And this is why it is of concern. This is why it is of interest. And it's something that we should be talking about and something that we should be aware of. So in the last 650,000 years, there have been 7 cycles of glacial advance and retreat, with the abrupt end of the last ice age about 11,000 years ago, making and marking the beginning of modern kind of climate era and of human civilization. Most of these climate changes are attributed to very small variations in the Earth's orbit, and that change the amount of solar energy our planet receives. So again, it's understanding we have these changes. This graph is showing us where we are right now. It also shows us where we were in 1950. So again, it's giving us that data and that information, which can be so important to people. When we look at where we are, there are policy changes. There are policies that exist at the moment, and it's really understanding about where those come from and some of the key elements. I always like to start off with the Paris Agreement. And the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is part of the group that leads that committee from the UN. The special report published by them shows the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, so that pre-industrial revolution, and related greenhouse gases and the pathways that we should really consider to explore. This also includes that change around climate change, but also recognising sustainable development and, really importantly, efforts to eradicate poverty. The IPCC agreement is almost universal. In Paris, it took a really defining moment to stop global warming beyond 2 degrees and ideally more than 1.5 degrees, which still, when we are now, so what's that, about 7, 8, 9 years on, is universally accepted that we're actually going to exceed this. So we need to develop policies going forward that actually will address this and will have real action and real impact for us, not just in terms of our work, but in terms of our social life and ability to live the lives we want to lead. When we kind of see this, what this is important in highlighting is some of the challenges and some of the actions that will come out of this. So things like heat waves, 1.7 billion people will experience severe heat waves. Obviously, depending on where you are in the globe, that will have different implications. Cast your mind back to a couple of summers ago when we had those excessive heat kind of moments. That is kind of our experience of that and our personal understanding of what that actually means. And I think this is really important in part of that. We obviously will see things like sea level rises, so coastal communities, particularly at risk here, climate related risks and poverty. We will see climate refugees as a result of this as well. And if you look at some of the more details, things like the coral reefs that support marine environments that have significant benefits in addressing climate change and maintaining climate and weather, could decline by a massive figure of almost 99%. So some really important figures, some challenges, some awareness there to kind of understand that. What we need to do in terms of these things is really understand it for our key temperatures and understanding that. So understanding where we are now, understanding what this means for us as people, understanding actually where the limits of that will sit, again, really important. And thinking about actually what does this mean for us personally, but also in terms of where our communities will be, the impact for our portfolios, and the estates that we look after, the buildings that we want to retrofit to be climate resilient as well. So we know that the global temperatures are roughly kind of about 1.2, 1.5, understanding that actually we need to try to be kind of reducing that amount, and understanding that actually a 2.4 increase on temperatures that we already experience will be really significant. There is research that shows that places like Manchester on the hottest day will potentially be 6.2 degrees hotter. So you imagine a 40-degree summer's day with 6.2 degrees on top. That's a significant overheating risk for tenants, for residents, for everyone involved. So understanding how we need to kind of address this is really important, and understanding how we can communicate this with people is part of that solution. The highest temperatures that we see in the UK have been significantly increasing at a faster rate than average temperatures. And particularly, we've seen that the southeast of England have increased by as much as 1 degree per decade. The figure that we can see here shows that the years in which temperatures failed to exceed 30 used to be a fairly regular occurrence in the past, and this has not happened since 1993. It's also worth noting that not every year brings a new record. For example, a maximum temperature of 32 degrees in 2023 is fairly low compared with actual recent figures that we've had. So again, understanding these fluctuations, understanding the local situation as well, really important. Within the UN and the kind of climate change groups, there is the working groups. The working groups put out lots of information and lots of reports, and I'd really recommend looking at lots of those as a source of information and data to provide to your stakeholders. When we're talking about greenhouse gases, what we're thinking about is that historical implication, but also what we need to do moving forward. With our retrofit projects, that's exactly what we're doing. We are moving things forward. We're making a difference. What they notice from this working group is that global emissions must peak in the next 30 months roughly to get us onto the right pathway. You can see these different pathways on the graph shown on the slide, and this is what we're trying to do. We are trying to move into different pathways that see that we will have a reduction in the amount of carbon emissions, and we can do that through energy efficiency projects and particularly retrofit projects for our homes. When we talk about greenhouse gases, there's a range. There are kind of 7 main kind of what we call a kind of basket of gases. There are other ones, but these are the main ones that for any kind of literature, any kind of communication should really be the focus. The primary one we talk about is obviously carbon dioxide. And when we kind of talk about it and when we report, sometimes we use a metric, which is carbon dioxide equivalence. So we put it into a metric that makes sense that if it was carbon dioxide, that is the equivalent for it. So when we're thinking about it, there's a whole suite of them. We need to think about our activities in our organisations, where they come from, what are the sources, what are the activities that generate those. So the main one is carbon dioxide. So about 76%, it does change kind of year on year, but this is a good kind of figure to utilise. This is largely from energy systems. It is from electrical systems that we use, heating our homes, heating our offices, transport in particular, so petrol, diesel, and industry. So the creation of materials, the creation of items that we use in manufacturing, in construction. Methane then, so livestock is about kind of 16%. We then have some kind of smaller percentages in terms of nitrous oxide, and then some of the fluorinated gases, which are particularly used much more in kind of heavy industry, electricity generation. So SF6, for example, is a insulating gas used particularly in kind of substations and those kind of areas. So again, thinking about it in the context of your organisation, where does that fit? How does it impact me? I'm really visual and I really like to kind of see things. So this is why we wanted to include this. Visualizing what 1 ton of something looks like can be, really challenging. So hopefully we're all aware of a double-decker bus and thinking about, okay, the size of that. If we kind of look at that in terms of the context of 1 ton of carbon, we can see that actually it's still bigger than that. So when we're talking about kind of that ton of CO2, this is what we're talking about. So it's large volumes, it's significant. Again, this is the kind of communication that's really important to people because sometimes we can't visualize it. So this is a really interesting kind of graphic to include. And for people, it's really important to think about, okay, well, what's my kind of likely footprint to be, in terms of what I do, how I live my life, the heating I use, the cooling, all of the kind of things that I do, how many flights you take, understanding actually what that looks like. what I like to do is kind of compare to others. So we can do averages. In the UK, approximately, it's about 15 tonnes per person. Australia, interestingly, is about 30 tonnes per person. But Malawi, which is a country in Africa, is 0.1 tonnes. So we can see that those residents of those countries have a massively different footprint. And therefore, actually, we need to be making sure that we are reducing our carbon, but also appreciating that everyone has a part to play here. If we break that down a little bit more, and this is really taken from a really fantastic book that I'd recommend if you haven't read already. It's called How Bad Are Bananas by Mike Berners-Lee. Really great, great book to read, and really easy reading as well. It's not overly scientific. This table is taken from there, and it really shows you the impact of everyday items that we can kind of think of. And sometimes it's important to see what that looks like. So if we're talking about kind of cement versus steel, you might work with new build projects. Absolutely thinking about, okay, well, do we need steel for structural elements within our new build, or can we look at cement? A project I'm working on at the moment, we've just made that big step. So rather than having structural steel, we're having structural cement instead. The savings for carbon are significant. So again, thinking about how we can play into that. Things like food, coffee, phones, flights all come into play. So thinking about how we live our lives, and how actually some people will have a higher carbon footprint on this call, some people will have a lower carbon footprint. Again, it's understanding that, breaking it down, thinking about how we can kind of use this as part of a decarbonisation journey. Thinking about it as well when we are talking about our retrofit projects, how can you equate it? So this retrofit project might see a carbon saving of 80. That's approximately a banana. I mean, I would hope it'd be more than that, because that's only grams. But those kind of analogies, you know, lots of bunches of bananas. You can kind of work it up, so it makes sense to people, and it ticks a box in terms of inspiring that passion. For the UK, what we've got to really understand is that we are an island nation. We understand that actually we have coastal and low-lying areas. So if this is applicable to you and your organisation, really think about that. Have a look at climate adaptation plans that might exist in your local council. Threats to agriculture in particular, the wet weather we've been having has really been significant. There have been news articles around where farmers' fields have been flooded for a significant amount of time. On the flip side of this, we also see risk of drought, water insecurity. So again, we need to kind of appreciate that water is part of this, as well as energy consumption. And understanding that disruption caused by storms, by heat, by transport issues. When it was really hot, the train line that I use warped, so I couldn't use my train, and I therefore couldn't get into work. So I had to kind of work from home that day, even though I planned to attend a meeting in person. So those kind of disruptions, those are becoming more kind of commonplace. So understanding how we can adapt to that, mitigate to that, really important with any kind of climate discussions that we have. I showed you one of these diagrams from the UN earlier, but in terms of where we need to be, and linking back to your retrofit project, what we really need to see is that rapid change. We need to have movement, we need to have at-scale changes. So what this means is rapid transitioning to renewable energy sources. Within industry, it's talking about kind of cleaner technology. Within transport, it's promoting sustainable and active transport measures. Within buildings, so this is where, you know, for most of us in terms of retrofit journey, it's about buildings, really thinking about that energy efficiency. So using less energy from a kind of fossil fuel based system, and utilizing that so it's much more efficient. Land use then is about thinking about carbon sinks through reforestation, through sustainable land management. Your organisation might already be doing kind of lots of projects around kind of planting trees in your local area. There are lots of projects that kind of have this in terms of a priority and sees massive benefits, as well as being a really nice community project to get involved with. As well as going to the data and the science and trusted sources, I also really like to kind of think about, well, what is the policy context? So for the UK, we obviously have the devolved governments, but we also have the kind of central UK government. The Climate Change Act that came in 2008 really set about legally binding emission reduction targets for the UK. It was, I think, one of the first globally legally binding mitigation targets set by any country. And what this tried to do was initially reduce the greenhouse gas emissions for the whole of the UK by 80% by 2050 compared to the 1990 levels. However, we saw in 2019 that the UK actually became the first major economy to commit to a more ambitious target of achieving net zero emissions by 2050. The old target was 80% by 2050. The new target is net zero. So really kind of thinking about, okay, this is being set by UK government. This is something that we absolutely need to look to and to adhere to. When we think about it in terms of how we're going to get there, the frameworks, the pathways, the UK government has ambitious targets around this to really pledge towards clean electricity by 2035. So that is rapidly increasing the wind, solar and nuclear within the portfolio. So if you imagine the electricity grid, it's made up of by a whole different range of different sources. We have interconnectors to the rest of Europe. We have our own nuclear power stations. We have gas powered stations, wind, solar, a whole mixture. And on different days, different renewable technology in particular will significantly contribute more. As a whole, that clean energy by 2035 is a real opportunity for decarbonising our grid, and therefore the electricity we use coming from a decarbonised source. But also important to focus on, actually, if we also use less electricity in our homes, in our buildings, that's also going to contribute to it. There's things around electric vehicles as well, in terms of kind of zero carbon offerings, in terms of the models that are kind of available, as well as other technological options. So things like capturing and storing tons of CO2, installing significant numbers of heat pumps. It's also thinking about more deployment of more energy from renewable sources, and really thinking about how we can really pull this forward. For us on the call, we're thinking largely around buildings. We're thinking around homes. There are approximately 30 million buildings in the UK, and heating these buildings contributes around a quarter of emissions. And addressing the carbon emissions from, in particularly homes, but also workplaces and public buildings, can be a significant opportunity to save money, but also improve lives in terms of air quality, support green jobs as well, and also really kind of make sure that we are doing the change that we should do. We haven't really talked about kind of aviation, and this is often quite a challenge, but really thinking about kind of net zero domestic flights might be an opportunity in kind of later years. But again, something to kind of think about in kind of those discussions. Transport has lots of opportunities, so things like rail upgrades, electric lorries, really thinking about how we can move people away from cars and more kind of active. But if we are going to still be utilising cars, thinking about electric vehicles, really thinking about as well things around kind of reducing landfill. So the goal is to reduce the amount of waste going to landfill, really increase recycling, eliminate things like single-use plastics, also thinking about how we do land ownership, improve support for some farmers, particularly within the context of climate change as well. When we look at it in terms of where the data is showing us, this is taken from the 2022 UK greenhouse gas report. You can access this yourself, so if you want to find the data as well. The emissions here are shown in kind of carbon dioxide equivalents. So I talked about that earlier. So the CO2e, just be mindful if you're kind of talking about metrics that you kind of pick that up as well. What this is showing that we can see that there has been a slight pivot, and there are some rises in the emissions in the UK. This can largely be attributed to the COVID-19 recovery. We did see a reduction because obviously the lockdown had implications there. We also have to take into consideration the kind of what are known as kind of degree days. So 2022 was considerably warmer than 2021. Higher energy prices also should be flagged up here, particularly towards the end of the year. But it's an interesting graph to kind of see from that 1990 level that we are making progress. We've got still some journey to go, but again, we are on the right path. So in your organisation, if we are thinking about how we're going to start talking about this, you might already have a plan. There might be an action plan with key kind of dates, figures, actions that you're going to be taken. But I just wanted to draw your attention to this from the National Housing Federation in terms of recognising that housing providers have a significant role in helping to get to that reduction plan. We also know that actually, we have some challenges in terms of retrofit, in terms of new build, really thinking about that net zero strategy and how to really push that forward in retrofitting our homes so that they will have climate resilience, they will be decarbonised, and they will be much more efficient. I've touched on kind of greenhouse gases. When we talk about it, we divide them into different scopes. So scope ones are direct emissions that a company owns or has control over. This would include emissions from burning fuel in a company-owned vehicle. So that is petrol, diesel. Scope one also covers emissions from sources directly linked to the organisation itself. Scope 2 emissions, these are indirect emissions caused by the company but incur from sources not owned or controlled by it. So this will be company purchases such as electricity. It will massively include all of those emissions associated with that energy consumption, because unless you are generating that energy on site, it will be about that purchased element for you. Scope 3 is the much trickier element to it. It is around emissions that are not produced by the company or directly linked to its assets. So this will be around the company's value chain. It involves suppliers and it involves consumers. Examples here include things like product use, disposal, and all of your supply chain activities. Understanding that, capturing that, getting the data can be a real challenge, but it's really important to have that included so that you understand where all your greenhouse gases are coming from. There we go, finally click through. So when we're thinking about this and when we're talking about it with our colleagues, when we're talking about it in the context of reports that we might be writing, it's all about understanding how what we're doing is we're managing risk. We're identifying cost-effective opportunities to reduce our carbon emissions. We're also going to be setting things like targets. We're going to be measuring and we're going to be reporting against that. So evaluating the context of your organisation. So again, defining your boundary. With any retrofit project, you're going to be designing the scope and where that's going to sit. Thinking about where your direct emissions come from, your purchased energy, and everything else. Thinking about what a baseline year might be useful. Quite a lot in kind of government documents, we talk about the 1990 levels because that's what's set in the Climate Change Act as a baseline. You might have a different baseline of most recent full set of appropriate data that you might have to consider. You want to be collecting that data, choose your emissions factor, use a transparent methodology. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is a really great place to start. There are other ones that you can have a think about. But establishing processes, establishing procedures, doing data checks, and really making sure that you can repeat this year after year. So we asked this question at the beginning, thinking about what your biggest challenges are. I'm asking kind of another question here about what are your biggest impacts? thinking about it in terms of your organisation that you have. Is it end of life treatment of products? Is it employee travel? Is it purchased goods and services, leased assets, sold products? For retrofit, it might be that actually we discover that transport is a really big impact. It might be operational buildings. You might have a really large portfolio with lots of offices, depots, workshops, garages. They might really be using a lot of heating, a lot of cooling, a lot of electricity to power things. So understanding where that fits is really important, and pulling together that whole picture can be a real challenge. What we're trying to do when we're thinking about it in terms of the asset life cycle. So we've got our portfolio, we've got an estate, we know that it's semi-detached houses from the 1950s. It's trying to understand also what it costs to run those, the operational emissions from that. So when we're looking at the life cycle of UK homes and buildings, its operational emissions are directly related to that emissions from the day-to-day running of that property. These operational emissions are assessed in a variety of ways. And for you and your organisation, it's key to think about which method is going to be best for you. There will be different levels. You might have requirements to report in a particular way. So really think about it in the context of your organisation. And these operational emissions are assessed in a whole variety of ways. Embodied emissions differ from operational emissions and can be calculated by adding the emission from producing, procuring, and the structural kind of elements, so including kind of maintenance, repair, and demolition of the emissions. This might be significantly more of a challenge for existing properties. If you have new build, it's a lot easier to understand what's gone in it and get the data. But understanding total life cycle and carbon footprint of a building is really important in being able to have that clear view of your portfolio and the emissions associated with that. Carbon emissions can be calculated by multiplying the energy, so kilowatt hours, by the emissions factor or the energy source. So knowing that it is maybe come from a gas system, it might be LPG, it could even be something like solid fuel. So again, those different fuel types will have a different emissions factor. We get those from the DEFRA website. Going back to housing, and this is taken from Letty from 2020, understanding where we are now and where we need to be, really thinking about it in terms of building regulations. So we obviously have to comply with building regulations, but in terms of those aspirations and where we need to get to, really thinking about it as an ultra low building, what's that actually going to look like? Particularly in the context that actually buildings that we have now will probably be around in about 100 years' time as well. If we're building in climate resilience now, that offers up as an opportunity to not have to retrofit it significantly in the future. I always like to go back to definitions, and lots of people like to find, to have that clear definition, the way that something has been defined. So we're just including two here, taken from the UK Green Building Council. So again, you can go and have a look at some of their documents. The net zero operational carbon kind of resources on there are really interesting to read. So do go have a look at those. What they pull forward for is achieving net zero carbon means that any carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere by an organisation's activity is going to be reduced as much as possible first, and then balanced by an equivalent amount of removal through offsetting. And this is the activity that then releases net zero carbon into the atmosphere. So you'll have a kind of balance, imagine it. You might be using a certain amount of emissions associated with your building, but actually you can only reduce that a certain amount because of the archetype, local restrictions due to planning, whatever it might be. But you might need to do some kind of offsetting, and therefore that might be some significant reforestation projects here in the UK or other schemes. So just being aware of how that might kind of play out. Defining something as carbon neutral means that the CO2 emissions are effectively cancelled by the use of offsetting. Offsetting means absorbing an equivalent amount through the atmosphere such as carbon capture, or as I just mentioned, reforestation. So how do we kind of move this forward? We've had a whole lot of information kind of going through. How does this kind of show us in terms of the work that we are doing? So like with the waste hierarchy, so on the left-hand side, you can see in terms of that kind of avoid, reduce, replace. The first step is to avoid those activities that generate carbon emissions wherever possible. This involves making conscious choices to reduce energy consumption, waste, and emissions. And this might be things like avoiding unnecessary travel or opting for virtual meetings instead of physical ones. Reducing is then about, if avoidance isn't feasible, we're trying to minimize the amount of emissions that we're kind of using. So thinking about energy efficient technologies, reducing the amount of waste, improving building the insulation, or using better energy efficient appliances. Replacing is then about replacing high carbon processes or materials with a carbon alternative. For example, like using renewable energy sources, so solar or wind, particularly for the UK, instead of fossil fuels. And then thinking about it in terms of being much more efficient. And then offsetting is around, offsetting is when everything else has been exhausted. So we've tried as much as possible to do all of the above. And what we're trying to do here is that these are projects that are going to be very specific, that will remove or reduce emissions elsewhere. So again, as I've mentioned, it's things like renewable energy sources. It's things like carbon capture, particularly reforestation. When we're thinking about this, what we've got to really think about is how can we influence this? If you are in a large organization, there will be a lot of employees. So how do you go about influencing that change? Thinking about it in terms of the carbon reduction hierarchy, in the reduction stage, there are possible approaches that can be taken to reduce total carbon. These can also be compared against your baseline, and using a metric can be a really useful way of doing that. And we can also use a target and a date to make sure that we're kind of pushing towards an achievement and a tick. So here's just some examples. So things around improving fabric, deliver capital program, whatever we call it, to reach a particular target. So we might have a particular number of targets we want to do by 2025, for example. We might want to reduce the energy consumption. We might want to improve the energy intensive figure that we get from all of those. So again, thinking about it in terms of your reporting, your scope of influence, so that you can really pull forward lots of opportunities. Hopefully this diagram isn't something new to you. If it is, these are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, also from the United Nations, really thinking about, actually, it's not just about carbon, it's about people as well. So the SDGs cover a whole range of different topics, many of them significantly interlinked. Thinking about poverty issues, gender equality, responsible consumption, the water, nature, and all of those kind of linking in together. When we talk about climate action, when we talk about climate action in housing in particular, we can really think about social justice. So things like fuel poverty. If we are doing a retrofit project because actually, well, it's the right thing to do, we're trying to maybe reach EPCC, we're trying to address fuel poverty as well. So that might be a significant issue for your portfolio. It's also thinking about actually community cohesion. So linking together communities to improve that space, making it much more about multiple people rather than individuals. That can really help in terms of our retrofit projects, as well as things like public health. If we are not using petrol, diesel cars, we're not using gas as our gas boiler, we're going to see significant improvements in air quality. So again, that is going to help human health and public health in particular. So again, in your reporting, it might be an opportunity to show those co-benefits and those kind of wider environmental, social and governance benefits for you and your organisation. So when we're action planning, really think about how it's going to kind of come forward. It is a journey. There will be a learning experience associated with that. So thinking about the kind of the key impacts, know your housing stock, think about the energy supplies that come through, thinking about the contractors, thinking about the suppliers that are utilised. Going back to the targets that you're setting, we always talk about SMART targets in terms of specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound. That gives you something to aim for. You know, if you make it really specific, it can be really helpful in pushing those agendas, monitoring, reporting, sharing those successes. But also, I think, and this is a key one of a kind of learning, is talking about things when they haven't gone as well. That can be really helpful in being clear and transparent, particularly with your tenants and your residents. So pulling everything together. Climate change is contributing to the rapid warming of the earth. We in the UK are absolutely experiencing this. March on record was the warmest March that we have experienced. You can go and have a look at the Met Office data on that. Again, it might not have felt like it, but the data shows us that was true. We're exceeding target temperatures and we are rapidly reaching a point of no return. We do know that the UK government has committed in law, so legally binding, to reach net zero by 2050. So that is a long-term target that we know that we have to be working towards. Housing is part of this, our own homes that we live in, but also the portfolios that we work with and manage. And organisations have an opportunity massively to create strategies, action plans to reduce the amount of carbon emissions that are associated with your actions and your activities. As always with our sessions, I would always like to draw your attention to kind of other resources. I've talked a lot about kind of the United Nations, some really great resources there, particularly for sharing with colleagues and key stakeholders. The UK Green Building Council has some really great research, examples, sessions you can join in as well. LETI, which is the Low Energy Transformation Initiative, has some really nice pieces on the design guide. So if design is where you fit in, some really nice pieces in there, as well as the National Housing Federation and lots of the other kind of available resources. We, of course, have lots of resources that you can kind of utilise and have a look at. We've got some pre-recorded masterclasses that we ran, must have been earlier in the year or kind of last year. Really great to go and have a look at. Again, share with colleagues, go and have a view, and then you can always come back to us if you do have any further queries or questions. So as always, you can email us, you can go on the website, and you can ask any questions that would be useful. So thank you so much for joining us.